You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Fire University. This is a podcast dedicated to fire ecology and management within the Natural Resource University podcast network. My name is Dr. Marcus Lashley. I'm a wildlife biologist, an assistant professor of disturbance ecology at the University of Florida, and a lifelong hunter that's passionate about wildlife conservation and management. In this podcast, I will interview scientists and professionals not only on the latest research in fire ecology, but also about their experiences in hopes that you as the listeners can learn why fire ecology is important and also how you can use it to meet your natural resource management goals. So let's get to the burning questions in Fire University. Welcome back to Fire University. Today, I have a real treat for everybody. I have a former graduate student that worked with me just not that long ago, and I guess about 2 years now since she graduated from the lab, and a current PhD candidate. He just became a candidate here recently who studies fire ecology in the lab right now. So Dr. Carolina Baruzzi, or goes by Carol, is here with us. And it's really a pleasure to have you, Carol. And I think that a lot of the research that you're doing right now is really cool in a different lab. You're in the fire science lab at the University of Florida with Dr. Ray Crandall as your advisor. So I was sad to see you leave the lab, but glad that we still get to interact and talk about some of these really awesome things that you're doing now. So you're studying reproduction in a really important plant in the piney woods in particular, that is wiregrass, right? So very important for the spread of fire in the system. And we thought it'd be fun to have David Mason in the conversation as well, because you studied plant reproduction, but from a very different perspective. You're studying animal dispersed plants that we might want to colonize if we're interested in wildlife, or let's be honest, deer and turkeys. A lot of the plants that we want to colonize after a burn are the things that you're studying. So welcome to the podcast. Really glad to have both of you.
Hi, Marcus. Yeah, thank you for having us. Yeah, that's wonderful being here.
Yeah, I'm excited. Let's do it.
Yeah, let's get going right on in. So Carol, you've got a couple of papers, I guess, that have come out recently, and I know you're working on some other stuff regarding wiregrass reproduction. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're studying and kind of some of the general findings that you're getting from that work?
Yes, so I specifically am looking at how wiregrass respond to fire, and not just fire, but to fire regimes. So as you know very well, and I'm sure very like most listeners know if they listen to your podcast, is that plants and animals in general respond to fire regimes. So for example, how often you burn plants, or like in which season you burn plants. And specifically with wiregrass, one of the attribute of fire regimes that I look at different with my current research group was the fire season. So we already know that typically wiregrass flower more if burned in the spring or summer. We also wanted to look at how well wiregrass seed germinate, because we thought it was really important, not just looking at how many flowers or how many flowering combs the wiregrass produce, but also how well then the seed do. And one of the things that we found in one of the recent papers that you were mentioning was that when burned during the spring, it actually produced our experimental plants produce more flowering combs. But
So you're saying flowering cone? Is that what you're
Oh,
saying?
sorry. I'm just full like grass vocabulary and just
Yeah. So you're basically mean like how many flowers is it producing so that it can make seed out of those flowers?
yes. So
Okay.
do you know? I'm sure both of you know wiregrass very well. So when you have like the bunch grass, and then when they flower, they produce like those stalks, like those
Yeah.
inflorescences
Yeah.
that are full of flowers and then seeds. So sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think
What I mean.
I know that we have at least 2 listeners that are plant ecologists, but
Yeah.
I know what wiregrass looks like and know the plant really well, and I know what it looks like when it's on fire. But I don't know what all the plant parts are called. So yeah, sorry for that question. I just wanted to
Okay,
make
no,
sure
no,
that
no, it's fine.
that I was
Yeah, sorry
understanding you.
for giving it for granted. It was a good question. So yeah, but we saw that actually we have much better germination rates from our experimental plants where plants were burned during the summer.
Okay, so let me try to recap what you just said. So a lot of research over the history of fire ecology, I guess, has kind of gotten a sense of when you burn at different times of the year, we end up with a different amount of wiregrass.
Yes,
Like that's just
exactly.
a different outcome of how much wiregrass is in the community. And then you've done some research to see how the flowering or seed production of the wiregrass is affected by the timing of the burn or the, isn't it, does it, I guess, did it have to be repeated fires too? You were saying regime, it's not just one fire in a given season, it's being repeatedly burned in that season even, right?
Yes. So,
Okay.
first of all, wait, I'll just take a step back and also like clarify that the like effects or like fire season on wiregrass reproduction. So, for example, the number of inflorescences produced have also been tested by like have been kind of well researched.
Yeah, so like the time when we already knew that the plant allocates more energy to
Yes.
flowering and reproduction, that was
Yeah.
pretty well established. So you also looked at the viability of those seeds and like how well they germinate based on their
Yes,
fire regime.
and
Okay.
yeah, and specifically in this study, we also looked at canopy cover, which to me it was one of the coolest part of the study because the results were completely unexpected. Like we saw exactly the opposite, to be honest, of what I was expecting.
Yeah, and I
Because-
think it actually because I know what the results were, it'll kind of be striking to the audience as well because they've probably heard me say things that are a little bit contradictory to your results pretty often, not in the context of wiregrass, but in the context of many of the plants that David studies anyway. So yeah, what did you find with the canopy
yeah,
cover?
yeah. Oh well, yeah. That's the fun of science, by the way. Always. Yeah. So what we found was that when plants were burned during the summer, the germination and the number of inflorescences produced was higher under partial canopy. So in our experiment, we kind of created 2 canopy categories because pine savannas are already very open. So we decided that a good threshold was above, when you have above 60% of light penetrating the canopy, then it can be considered open. When you have below, it was kind of considered partial canopy.
So let me make sure I understand. Because you're in a pine savanna, 60% canopy cover is kind of high.
Yes, because pine savanna are already very like
Yeah.
they are savannas, right?
Yeah.
So they are supposed to
Yeah,
have
sparse trees.
yes,
So
exactly.
so I mean, when we're talking about managing for wildlife species and pine plantation, we're talking about trying to reduce the canopy down to 60% or 60 basal area is what we'd say often. But you're talking about that's the high end on in your particular system. You know, we're talking about a really sparse tree canopy in most of the savannas.
Yeah, so we did our study at Ordway's Fisher Biological Station, and I mean, I'm sure you know it. You have been there. It's already like pretty sparse. So for us, yeah, it was. Since it's a very well maintained, the sites where we conducted our study was like a really good example of like pine savannas. So they were pretty sparse. But what we find, so you would expect wiregrass to do very well in the open. So the more open the canopy, the better wiregrass does, right? That's at least what I was expecting before starting this study. But it actually was the opposite for us when plants were burned during the summer. Because when plants were burned during the summer, they produce more inflorescences and the seeds germinated more when they were under a partial canopy, which was really striking. I remember when I showed, sorry, I'm just going to add this. When I first showed the results to Ray Crandall, my current advisor, she told me that she saw the plot and she just said, "Hey, you have mislabeled the like your legend. Like that should be open and that should be cover. No, sorry, that should be open and that should be partial." And I looked at her and I was just like, "No, that's right."
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. You've already done the math a few times and checked on that.
Yeah.
by the time she saw it. That's really cool. So yeah, I guess we're typically thinking about a forest system where it's light limited, where you opening up the canopy, you see this flush and seed production, which we'll talk about here with some of David's stuff, I think. But so the light is having access to enough sunlight to produce the seeds and germinate is the limiting factor, whereas in your studies in these wide open places, it may actually go the opposite direction, where you kind of get to the point where there's so much sunlight it might become limiting because of the way it affects microsites or something, right? Is that generally what you think is happening?
So that's a really good point. I'm not sure if that's what it could be happening. Likely, there are some factors associated to higher canopy, like, for example, soil moisture, that are likely driven our results. We did not measure soil moisture or other environmental variables that were related to canopy cover. We just measured canopy cover. So unfortunately, I cannot be sure. If we speculate, just speculating without keeping in mind that yes, I don't have data to back me up. I have the feeling that soil moisture is really important, especially in the summer when plants, when temperatures are high. I have the feeling that in our case, more than being light limited, it could have been more likely soil moisture or other parameters associated again to the soil. But it's hard to tell. That's future research that we're definitely going to explore this in the future.
Yeah, well, that's kind of how science works, right? We build on our previous questions, and people had, like you said, observed that there was different amounts of wiregrass following different fire regimes, and then go a little further and figure out the plants are responding the way they allocate resources to reproduction differently. And now you're taking that farther to show that they may germinate under different scenarios, better or worse. And the next logical step would be figure out what site characteristics or environmental things are governing that response that you found. So it makes perfect sense to me. So in general, it sounds like in the piney woods where wiregrass is a primary facilitator of the spread of fire and is extremely well adapted to take that role, the plant seems to be performing better when you kind of have some canopy and it's the fire is occurring in the summer. Do you think that's an accurate consolidation of what you just said?
It is, but also I advise cautious, because so that's the thing. I think it depends what your goals are and what you want to do when you like manage the land, or like
Mhm.
if you restore a certain habitat, because like wiregrass, it's actually like what I'm seeing now is that it doesn't die. Like it's very tough,
Yeah,
wiregrass.
the wiregrass
So
just
like
sits around and keeps growing back
yes,
over and over
and
and over.
even yeah, like another one of our studies was actually in a long unburned pine savanna. I honestly don't remember exactly like how many years went before, like between fires, but it was like usually, pine savanna can burn between 1 or 3 years or 1 or 5 years. Um, Instead, like those plants have been unburned for like I think 16 years. That's really
Oh,
bad. I should know because that's
Yeah.
part of my research. But now,
Nobody's judging you about not remembering every little detail about every number
thank you,
that you've
thank
looked at.
you.
How many tens of
Um,
thousands of analyses have you run this
yeah.
week?
So thank you for your understanding. But yeah, basically what we saw is that even under duff, and after being unburned for such a long time, wiregrass was like still surviving fire and still reproducing.
Hmm.
So
Well, the
um,
other thing that is to me equally interesting about what you just said is it's also showing that wiregrass is pretty resilient to sitting around without fire for a while.
yes, yeah, it's I think we still need to obviously understand a lot about these plants. So they may shrink, right? Because like
Yeah.
wiregrass, they form these huge bunches, and for example, if they get covered in litter, so like for
Hmm.
example in pine needles, they may slowly kind of die back and shrink,
Yeah.
but it's a very slow process. And from what we've seen, at least it does not, like it didn't affect the survival. In our experiment, just extremely small plants died, the plants
Hmm.
that were very small. So yeah, it's really tough. I actually, when I came here in Florida, I was really excited about my project, and I was excited to dive into like the grass world because I've never really focused my research on grasses.
Hmm.
But I didn't have any particular strong feelings for wiregrass. Instead, I have to admit, like now, I don't know, I really love that plant because it's so amazing. It's just so tough,
Yeah.
and it's so
I really
important
like it.
for. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Mm.
like it because it'll catch on fire when it's raining, which is
Yeah.
pretty, I mean, just, it'll burn in the rain and I'm about it. I like that plant.
Mm-mm.
It's kind of,
can I ask a question?
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, so you're talking about the difference in canopy cover out there at Ordway, and I was wondering if there was differences related to that canopy cover in the litter.
that's a really good question. That's what we thought initially. It could have been like, hey, maybe there's more litter, so the fire temperature
That's
change.
exactly what I was
Right.
thinking. Yep.
Yes, that's such a good observation. I mean, I'm biased because that's what I thought too. But actually, since the sites where we were conducting our research were burned pretty frequently,
Right.
there shouldn't have been high differences in pine litter. And there have been studies on this
Hmm.
that show that when sites are burned frequently, usually fire temperature doesn't change much.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So
Well,
yeah, no, but it was a very good point.
another thing, I think it's an important point, and you reminded me of it. I actually, a lot of my PhD and postdoc work was in pine savanna, and in lonely pine savanna, similar to yours, and it was actually sandhill as well, so it's also similar to Ordway. But I was measuring plant biomass, so a little bit different, and I was thinking about it from what wildlife like to eat, which is most of the time not wiregrass, but it included wiregrass sampling in it.
Mhm.
And I remember a reviewer made me take this out of a paper because at the time, I guess it was controversial, but I was looking at wiregrass and all these different fire regimes and a bunch of other plants as well. But this is the one that they made me take out because I essentially came to a very similar conclusion to what you are saying, or at least that's what I'm hearing from you. I'm not sure, maybe I'm not interpreting it correctly, but what ultimately concluded when I was looking at the biomass of wiregrass and all these different under all these different fire regimes is as long as there was enough sunlight getting in where it wasn't a light limiting thing, they were extremely tolerant of a wide range of fire frequencies. What I took home for that and was trying to get into this paper that reviewer number 2 did not appreciate for some reason or another, and I don't remember the details of the argument, but that to me is an important note about the system. You know, we really commonly want to apply fire at some historical frequency, and we take the average of what that frequency was over time. So we take dendrochronology or whatever, and we like, oh, on average, this system burned every 2 years, or this one burned every 3 years. And then we go out and apply that uniformly, if possible, to a place. But in reality, when you look at those historical records, the fire frequency was extremely variable. And we have condensed that down to a mean that's really simplistic, right? Which is by design, it makes it easier to manage. But the reality is these plants like wiregrass are showing us that they're adapted to a regime that was highly variable. And it's perfectly conceivable that an individual plant that's in a frequently burned pine savanna may go through a decade here and there where there isn't any fire. And then it might go through another decade where it burns twice a year, every year for the whole decade. So it's probably pretty variable. And that's something that I think is interesting, and that as fire ecologists, people should be thinking about maybe studying. There's probably some inherent importance just in that variability within the system.
Yeah. And it makes sense for such a species that is, so slow to reproduce, but yet so widespread, or at least historically was so widespread that it would be tolerant to a range of different conditions for sure.
Yeah, it does make sense.
Yeah, and I think like what you say is so important. Like we need to remember like that heterogeneity,
Hmm.
generally speaking, promotes biodiversity.
Yeah.
Even like with the, for example, fire season, I've specifically looked at, for example, different plants in pine savannas, and there have been studies that show that, for example, I don't know, legumes produce more, like different species of legumes
Hmm.
produce more seeds when burned, like in season that were different than, for example, wiregrass or other plants. So, like, I think it's a very important message saying that yeah, as long as we have heterogeneity, even in fire, when we think that, as you just said, like there are certain characteristics of fire regimes that we think are that way.
Hmm.
Um, we actually just promote biodiversity if we promote heterogeneity.
Yeah. No, I think that's something that I harp on all the time. I know that the listeners have heard me talk about pyrodiversity and biodiversity and trying to encourage heterogeneity in plant communities. But, that's why we have to be really careful too when we're producing the science and then interpreting that into a management strategy is, oh, wiregrass reproduces most or best after applying it in this month on this return interval. So then we go and do that everywhere,
Yeah.
right? We go
Yeah.
apply a ubiquitous 2-year return interval only in June. And it's like, well, that's, that might maximize the reproduction of that one plant or whatever,
Yeah.
but it's probably not the best approach to meet many objectives, like we often are trying to
Yeah.
on public
That's
lands in
yeah.
particular. So
Yeah, and also like one thing that just the last thing I want to add is that I think it's very important to consider the goal, what you're trying to do, because sometimes, like, do you want your plants to maximize reproduction? Like, do you always want that? Because
Yeah.
sometimes, for example, if you have like a beautiful wiregrass site where the population is already like well established, I think it's also important to send a message that you don't always have to like make a massive effort, for example, to burn when the most recent science is going to tell you that the plants are going to maximize their reproduction, because maybe in your case, maybe it's not necessary.
Yeah.
So yeah, management and
Yeah.
restoration is so complicated.
Well,
People that do that have all my admiration, because it's just it's really complicated. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good point. And your example that you just gave, plant reproduction of wiregrass is not a limiting thing to the population of wiregrass at that point. And if your objective is diversity, narrowing it down to maximize your fire regime down so that it maximizes plant reproduction of that plant could actually decrease the diversity response. That's your main objective, right? It's just an indicator of what that plant, like the suite of adaptations that it had, how it maximizes its response to fire. It doesn't mean that should be ubiquitously applied everywhere because of that indicator. And
Yeah.
I think that's an important message for people to think about. We say, oh, this burning promotes this and that's better for that thing, but you don't really want to do the same thing everywhere. You really, if you're mixing it up, you're more likely to positively influence a suite of species in the system or processes in the system.
Yeah. And as I heard already in your podcast and just talking with you multiple times, the most important thing is just burn.
Yeah.
So
Fire. Yeah. In these systems, fire is a really important factor that shaped the way that the communities function and structured. And of course, I think all of our listeners would agree, we just want more turkeys in there, and they respond really well to a diversity of fire applications on the ground. I was being facetious. About 3 of our listeners don't want to have more turkeys. Like, that's not driving their decisions.
Yeah.
We only have 7 listeners, so I guess that's close to the majority. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, David, I guess you study more bird dispersed plant species in a longleaf system, so still a fire prone system. How is this different from the wiregrass, which I don't want to pick on wiregrass, but it kind of forgot to figure out the whole reproduction with seed thing in comparison to some of these other plants. So I was just curious, how do these same ideas relate to what you're doing?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing to think about is that wiregrass doesn't produce a fruit, so it's going to be less likely to be dispersed by animals. Although we can get into how often.
Yeah, we're not going to get into that.
Yeah, so
you and I can get into it in the back room when we're really trying to hash out things, but I don't think people.
Yeah.
Maybe they do. If you guys want to get us to get into the nitty gritty details of all these really complex interactions, I'm more than happy to do that. You can email us and let us know.
I'm just saying, let's give deer their due. That white-tailed deer can consume seeds of a variety of species, even those that don't necessarily produce fruit, and still disperse seeds. And I want to give them their credit.
So and they actually, wiregrass shows up in their diet more than you would think, probably on accident, because they're trying to eat the little forbs that are in the plant, and they just grab some of it. But it's sort of the same idea of what I just said, what you're talking about, where the foliage is the fruit. where deer might walk around eating leaves and accidentally ingest some seeds and disperse them.
That's right.
They
There's
didn't
multiple
even,
ways, yeah,
yeah.
multiple ways to get at it. But let's stick with, typically thinking about something that produces fruit, and then they can sort of piggyback on the animal to get to a better spot to colonize. And that's probably the big difference between wiregrass and something like, blackberries or, sumac species, or anything that you can think of that produces fruit. And that's important because where animals go to deposit those seeds can impact whether your plant can establish or not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I
Yeah.
would argue that wiregrass is more independent, so you should not pick wiregrass for that.
That's fair.
More independent. Yeah, and quail, they often will nest right up against them, so I'll give them that.
Yeah, produce a nice cover for everyone.
Yeah, and they promote fire to progress across, even if it's raining outside.
Yeah,
Still, so
well, everybody
yeah,
likes that. So
yeah, more fire.
Yep.
Okay, I'm back. I'm back in the middle on the wiregrass. Okay, you got me back.
all right, but let's say wiregrass facilitates some fire. We typically think about the green up that comes after fire as attracting herbivores, and then there's all kinds of ecological consequences you can think of attracting herbivores to a recently burned area. But what we're studying in our studies is that fire can also represent a resource pulse for seed dispersers. And if we think about fire as getting rid of a lot of the above ground biomass, opening up places to colonize, this could have a serious impact on plant community establishment. So I'm out there with seed traps in recently burned areas. These are perches for birds with a seed trap beneath them, and then I'm measuring what the birds are bringing in, digging through the bird poop and counting up the seeds.
What is the most common bird seed disperser in your that you find in your experiment?
What they disperse, or
the bird species?
Bird species?
Yeah, the most common bird species.
Well, it depends on the time of year, but a mockingbird is a really common species there, particularly at tall timbers. But really, there's a ton of bird species at tall timbers, so it's pretty diverse assortment.
What? How many species? Just like a ballpark. How many bird species are you? Let's say that you put you're monitoring for a whole year.
Yeah.
How many different species of birds that disperse seeds are you going to encounter in a given year?
I would give a conservative estimate and say that we've gotten between 20 and 30 birds so far on the data. But not all of those are seed dispersers. I mean, we'll get vultures and hawks and all kinds of stuff perching on the seed traps.
Well, they may, the vulture might eat a dead bird that was dispersing seeds, and then
you never know, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe
just made
again, we're getting into details here that's probably irrelevant to our audience, but fun to talk about in the back room for scientists. Yeah, so you're
probably like a dozen. Yeah, I mean, I'd say slightly less than that, but getting complicated again. It depends. A lot more species can disperse fruit than you would normally think of. We have a typical set of.
So you're talking about maybe a dozen that we know that's a big role that they play, and then you may have a handful of others that are doing some seed dispersal that we wouldn't have thought of.
Yeah, that's a fair characterization.
Okay.
What's the most? I'm sorry, Marcus. I'm doing the podcast now.
No, this is a conversation. Okay. You jump right on in there whenever you get ready.
Okay, thank you. No, I just wanted to know, what's the most unexpected disperser that you found?
Well, I mean, do you mean, well, I mean, we have the camera trap data, right? And we're seeing them visit. And, you may catch them, depositing scat on the camera trap. But other than that, I'm coming to check the seeds afterwards. So I can't link a seed to a single bird, if that makes sense.
Oh, no, I see. But what's the most unexpected bird that you found that you thought, oh God, I was not expecting to find, these birds in my traps?
Maybe a tanager. I wasn't ready to see them, but I don't think they're particularly rare or anything. But that shocked me when I saw it. It's a beautiful bird.
It's kind of really elaborate.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think you showed me was it a maybe it was a vulture that was on the seed trap. It was something really big one time.
Yeah,
And I was like, whoa, that's not
yeah.
what I
It's
wasn't
all
expecting that to
wobbly.
be on the perch.
Yeah, it's all wobbly and everything. It can, they're wobbling back and forth. They look too big for it. I don't know why they love to perch on it. There's plenty of trees around, but
Yeah,
they love my seed trap.
yeah, that's funny. So similar question, David. How many plant species are being, like, how many are you catching, and like how many species of plants?
We're up around 30 or 40 by now.
Wow.
I mean, yeah, it's.
Are any of them wiregrass?
I don't think we've gotten wire. Well, actually, yeah, we'll get wiregrass, but I don't think they're being dispersed by birds.
Yeah, I
We
was
can
just
catch them,
kidding.
but we catch a lot of things through the wind as well.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. But yeah, it's a lot. I mean, most species are rare, and we'll catch a lot of those rare species in
Yeah.
our traps.
Well, that's really cool, because I mean, just that's pretty crazy diversity. You're in in an upland pine system,
Yep.
and you're catching that many animal dispersed seeds. That's pretty wild. So what do you think the most common seed is that you're catching?
Well, it's a race between, I say, blackberry, beautyberry. I think roost is coming up in there a little bit too, and then of course pokeweed. They're battling it out.
Pokeweed. I love the pokeweed.
Yeah, me
It's a
too.
good plant. Cool. So you're catching a lot of several really high end wildlife plants. So that's cool.
Yeah, wildlife are dispersing the seeds that are important to wildlife.
Yeah, I think that's an important point.
Mhm.
There are a lot of plants obviously making up the community, and they're playing their own roles. Like wiregrass is carrying fire through the system. That's an important role that is needed in it. And then a lot of the things that are really strong value for wildlife are getting brought there by wildlife. So that's a cool feedback that I really like.
Yeah, but they may be bringing them there at an opportune time too, which is what we're focusing on.
Mm-hmm. So like the way that the system's functioning in terms of the timing could be really important for what plants colonize after the fire.
Exactly, and that's something we've noticed. We get the big spike in animal activity, and the big spike then in the seeds that they're bringing occurs in let's say the first month or so following the fire. So obviously plants are fruiting and flowering at different times throughout the year. So when you burn is gonna impact what arrives there.
Yeah. So something that just on the last episode came up, and I couldn't remember the details, but I thought you would remember better. In the study related to fire, have you caught any non-native plant species? I couldn't remember. I was thinking, at least the last time I checked on that particular thing, you had not caught any, but have you now?
I don't think so.
I was thinking that
That's impressive.
Yeah,
I was thinking we couldn't even, I think when I had asked you and you went through the data, you had not caught a seed from a non-native plant.
I think we may have gotten non-native grasses through the wind.
Yeah, but in terms of
again,
animal
yes.
dispersal,
Yeah.
because you had maybe some of the like Vasey's grass or something, and improved pasture grass that had gone in there. That is impressive. And another one that I did remember a little more clearly, it was a precursor to your experiments with seed dispersal related to fire, where we were just trying to figure out how to catch seeds from birds. And we did the experiment in Alabama, where I don't know, maybe 700 million privet seeds per acre were available for the birds. I mean, it was like a privet thicket, right? Like privet and what was the ilex species?
Ilex vomitoria.
Yeah, what's
Yalpin.
the common name?
Yalpin.
Yeah, Yopon holly. That's what folks are where I come.
Gotcha,
Everybody
sorry.
that I came.
Sorry, I got that New Jersey pronunciation going on.
Yeah. My people say Yopon.
All right, Yopon. I got it.
The
Sumter
correct
County.
pronunciation is
Yopon. Yeah.
Yopon.
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 I tell you.
Okay,
Yeah,
whatever.
whatever. I don't know what the that's what the folks that listen to this thing know it as. Anyway, so Yopon holly, there was a lot of it available, but I don't even think it was comparable to the
Yeah.
privet fruit. I mean, it's fruit everywhere
Yep.
to the degree that, you know, they're just like, we thought when we put out those traps, we're going to have a mound of privet seeds that birds have dispersed in these traps. And I remember us catching one privet seed. Is that?
Yeah, and it's something I think about all the time. I mean, I know that you know, something like Lonicera, a naturalized species,
Yeah.
honeysuckle. You know, I know that that's dispersed, but some of these other, you know, big time fruit producers, you know, they're everywhere. So it kind of leads you to think that they
Yeah.
must be getting dispersed.
Well, and that's what I was
So
thinking.
maybe they're
They've all got these fleshy fruits on it. There's tens of billions of them per acre. Of course, the birds are dispersing them everywhere, and we kind of throw the birds under the bus. And then we did that experiment where literally the fruit could fall off the plant into the trap, and we
Yeah.
caught one seed, and that blew me away. But this is something that, you know, there's been some interest, and people have contacted us about that, and every time I tell anybody that, they're just kind of blown away, because we assumed that birds were dispersing all these plants, and they probably are in some context, but in that one where I thought, man, the privet's coming in, we're about to catch a mound of it, and we literally caught thousands and thousands of Yopon holly and one seed from privet.
Yep. I think about the Christmas berry that we have all around Gainesville. That
Yeah.
stuff is everywhere too, and it makes me wonder. You know, I would love to do some work with it. You know, it makes me wonder how it affects the, you know, from the plant's perspective, right? The plant is competing with other plants, even of the same species. It's competing for dispersers. It's trying to get their attention so it can get the dispersal. And you know, you got, you know, this invader in there with all these fruit around. If it does feed on those fruit, that's really going to affect the availability of the disperser.
Yeah.
If it doesn't, then how the heck is it getting around everywhere? How's it dispersing so much?
Yeah, that's I mean, it could be mammals, or you know,
Yeah,
maybe
that's
it's,
what I was gonna ask too.
but
That yeah,
It's a
if you
great
think
point.
it's more mammal.
yeah. And well, another thing is a key characteristic of invasives, well, there's suite of them, but they produce tons of viable fruit, but those things are also viable whether they go through an animal or not.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking
So
too.
they may just, you know, maybe
drop 'em.
that one seed that got dispersed by a bird that accidentally ate it one time, you know, then that plant can propagate many thousands of more plants,
Yeah.
and they continue to spread that way, where they, you know, the fruit just falls off the plant or something.
Or
But
insects, yeah, when they fall off, insects moving them around. You know, even if
Yeah.
it's a slower in terms of how long it takes them to spread. You know,
Well, and I also wonder, maybe I should try to find somebody who's an expert on frugivory and birds, but I also wonder with these non-native plants like the privet, for instance, that the color of that berry is not near, it doesn't look like any of the other native stuff, right? Same thing with your honeysuckle, the berry doesn't look like anything else in the system. And I wonder if there's some mismatch even there where the birds are just not keying in on those as food like they
Yeah.
do some of those other ones. I mean, I know they eat them, but
yeah,
it's just we keep doing these studies, and I keep expecting that to be a problem, you know, where non-native plants are a big part of it. They're certainly in the landscape, and they seem to be trying to get things to disperse them. And we keep finding that birds aren't the culprit. So
yeah.
it just brings up more questions, doesn't it?
Yeah, there is some work about concerning like the choices that horticulturalists make, or the choices that we all make based on, you know, what we like aesthetically in a plant and its foliage and its fruit, and how that relates to, you know, the interactions with the native fauna, which is pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Does the privet? Sorry, I just have a question about the privet because I know that it's basically his leaves are around all year, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
What about the fruit?
Semi-evergreen, yeah.
Okay.
The fruit's really strongly available through the winter.
Okay.
because like when we did that study, there were only a handful of things around was the other thing that was crazy. There was
Yep.
pretty much Yopon and privet. That would have been 99.9% of the fruit available, and there were millions per acre. And then there were greenbrier and a couple of things like that were common, but they certainly weren't dominating the fruit availability. There's certainly roost, a couple of different sumacs around. So there were some other things like that were persisting through the winter. Of course, the other thing is there weren't that many bird species either, and maybe it was just those few bird species weren't keying in on it. But they were the ones that are around during the prime fruiting for the species. I think cardinals were primary.
Yep, cardinals.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. So with the plant colonization via bird dispersal, it sounds like there's a diversity of plants that may actually be hitching a ride on birds or in birds to get to burned areas.
Yep.
And not a lot of them are non-native species from what we can tell in this study, which is on a site that has plenty of invasive plants. I mean, it's not like they aren't around.
Yep.
Like Christmasberry, even that's around, right?
Probably.
I think that I know one of your sites is kind of close to a place they showed me a bunch. But yeah, it's just really, really crazy. So everybody that's been blaming it on the birds out there, we may ought to rethink that. I'm including me in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, like, it's very interesting actually hearing about David's research because now that I work like primarily in pine savannas and the sites, since I study wiregrass, like most of the sites where I work are covered in bunch grasses where, sometimes it's predominantly wiregrass, sometimes it can be like wiregrass and drop seed, like it depends. But I think less about seed dispersal because, the plants that I'm studying technically don't really rely on, as we were saying earlier, other animals to disperse. So it's really incredible thinking
as far as
about,
we can tell.
all this diversity, how much is promoted by interactions.
It's important that's a thing that I have to always remind myself, and I'm liking to hear you talk about your system as well, because we're ostensibly in the same system, but there's a lot of variation nestled within that. Just like we were talking about heterogeneity before. I mean, tall timbers is a lot different from Ordway. It's got a different site history, and you get different plants there. All that stuff matters, and the degree to which birds may be a factor after a fire bringing these plants in, that could vary depending on the system for sure.
Yeah, and it if there's nowhere for one to germinate because of all the wiregrass, so it might not matter that much.
Well, wiregrass actually in this, I'm sorry, I know I'm very
is this
biased.
a fun fact? It seems like a fun fact.
So it can be a nurse plant.
Yes.
Well, I was gonna say earlier that the tree, the longleaf pine, seems to be a nurse plant for the wiregrass, but now you're telling me the wiregrass could be a nurse plant. So explain.
Isn't that interesting? And actually, is they have studied pine. My research, I was not in that study, but it was from my research team. They showed that pine seedlings up to I think just a few years, they are actually like they have like a bigger diameter and they're taller, growing close to like under the bunch grass, because bunch grass like form this sort of canopy, and I don't know, this canopy somehow could potentially promote other plants, like for example changes the soil moisture, or maybe even preventing herbivory.
There's this. I was looking at this for my qualifying exams, but there is experiments where people have removed wiregrass to basically look for competition, and found no evidence that it was competing with the other plants, which is really interesting. I think it was maybe Wale, but there is research on the competitive effects of wiregrass, and didn't appear to be negatively impacting, which is interesting.
Because other plants can grow. Like I so often find other plants growing inside wiregrass. Another really cool thing is that what I'm seeing, that's unpublished research, but I'm working on it. Hopefully it's going to be out soon. Is that so we sampled several bunch grasses individual. So we sampled wiregrass and dropseed at Ordway. And we saw that the species richness close to these plants is the same, is not significantly different. But there are some species that are associated with one plant or the other.
Interesting.
So obviously we're going to do more in the future to kind of trying to understand a mechanism.
So are you saying that two species of nurse plants are nursing a different set of species?
That's what...
Even though they're structurally kind of similar?
Yes. And so for now, we can just say they are associated. So we cannot say exactly what's the mechanism.
I'm going to go ahead and post my bet that it is interactions.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take that.
Like the plant is hosting some other organism that's influencing those plants being associated with it, like an insect or something, or your favorite fungi. But yeah, that's really interesting. It also made me think of the stuff that we were seeing out in Oklahoma, David, with, I can't think of the name of the plant now, but or a cactus. No, it was a bunch of
yes,
cactus,
I remember you talking about that.
where the little moss
I was thinking the same thing
of cactus.
Yes.
So it was serving as a nurse plant because all the little thorns and prickles or whatever on it were keeping herbivores from being able to graze there. So there's a whole suite of species of plants that were associated with those little bats of cacti. It was really cool.
Yeah, that was really neat. Yep.
So
they kind of grow flat. They were their pads are growing out from sort of like a centralized point. Maybe not always, but they sort of made like a little cage, and inside of there you could peek in there and see all these different little wildflowers growing inside there.
Yeah, and they didn't exist outside of the little cactus. Protection. So pretty cool. Yeah, that's one of my favorite things about what we do, is that you find joy in some of those processes that are playing out that add to biodiversity overall and the stability and function of the system, and feed into how many turkeys there are, all those sorts of things. More diverse plant communities means more bugs to eat when you're a 2-inch tall turkey poult.
Yeah, or more fruits for David's birds. Right.
Yeah, exactly. But birds are cool and everything, especially when they are turkey bird. All right. Well, I really appreciate y'all coming on the show. It was really fun talking to you, and we've been working together for years now, so it's always fun to talk about this stuff with you. Normally, we're not doing it in front of a bunch of people like this, so it's fun doing that as well, so they kind of get a glimpse into what we sit around and talk about in the back room. So a lot of fun. I always like to close with letting the listeners know how they can find you if they're interested in following up with you about something, or just following what you're doing. So Carol, where can they find you?
They can. I was unprepared for this question. I don't know why that's the hardest question.
Just like social media.
So I have Twitter.
Is that the best way?
It's actually at Oaks and Goats.
Oaks and Goats.
Or
I
also mention something that actually we recently started doing. It's primarily my PI Rick Randall, but she also have a Wiregrass blog. So if you're interested in knowing like all the details about wiregrass explained for like in a way that is not too scientific. So if you don't want to read the paper, you can look at the Fire Lab, University of Florida Fire Lab, and there is a Wiregrass blog in there, so you can find all the.
Cool. Oh man, I will also be starting a bird.
That would be amazing. You should do it.
Yeah, have the Wiregrass getting all the
Yeah.
attention.
I'm not going to start a blog. That's what I started the podcast for.
Yeah, that's
So don't be looking for my
yeah.
blog.
But
out
in
there.
there, sorry, it
But-
was also for saying in there's also my email. So if for any reason you wanna
Okay.
talk
Nice.
grasses or anything,
Well, and your handle is Oaks and Goats because you've also done a fair amount of work with oaks and goats.
yes, and so,
turns
so
out.
yeah, if you wanna talk about goats, feel free to
Yeah.
call me or
Yeah, and you've worked all over the world on a variety of ungulates, I guess,
Yeah.
right? So chamois and
and yeah,
uh,
wild-tailed
I don't
deer,
even
the
know what
wild
else.
boar, pharaoh swine, yeah.
Yeah. So David, where
Yeah,
can
you can
folks
find
find
me
you?
on Instagram or Twitter at EcoGraffito. That's EcoGraffito. EcoGraffito. And I would be mortified not to correct this mistake, but I was talking about some research earlier, and it was Roth and Myers and Harms. If anyone's interested in
Oh,
that
which
competition,
We'll put a
Wiregrass.
link to it.
All right, thank you.
We'll put a link to it in the show notes. So we always do that. I think most everybody knows that's been listening a while, but if you're interested in the studies that we're talking about, we generally try to put a link to those studies in the show notes so that you have ready access to it. And of course, we're happy to field questions if you want to reach out to me as well. You can contact
sure.
me on social media at Dr. Disturbance or via email. It's just my name at ufl.edu. So happy to field those questions. And yeah, I know you guys are both really active on social media and post a lot of cool stuff about your research and findings and everything. So I encourage everybody to go and follow both of you because I enjoy seeing your content.
Thanks so much.
But thanks again for coming on the show. It was really fun.
Thank you so much.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Fire University is part of the Natural Resource University podcast network funded by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you like what you heard today in this episode, please follow us on all the social media platforms at UF Deer Lab.